Hello and welcome to Big Bandit Gaming. I have a little bit of a bonus episode here. It's just me, Troy, today. What I thought I would do is I have, as you can probably read from the title, I am making a tier list. And I'm looking at the Final Fantasy series today, so that's the main core series. So it won't include things like Crisis Core or Final Fantasy Tactics or anything that isn't one of the core ones, even though I think, for the record, Crisis Core and Tactics would be pretty high up on here. Another notable shout out is if Chrono Trigger was in here, that would be an automatic guess. So keep that in mind. So let's just jump right in here. Everyone here has seen a tier list before, so you know what's going on. I have S through E, and I will rank them in the order. It's interesting, right? Because you can make a tier list on, like Take Seven, on how influential it was to games or to like people who played it around the same time. But this is a personal list. So, seven, if we're talking about influential games, yes, it would be an S, but you will see where seven falls on my list. And I hope you're still watching after that happens. All right, so let's jump right into one. Before I even jump in here, I did not play all of these in the order they were released. Um, one came out before I was born, like in the 80s. So that right there should make sense. I think my first Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy X, and I've either beaten or played everything on here, at least a little. So I played most of these all out of order, and that really, you'll see that where that affects where things land on the list. So let's just jump in here. I have Final Fantasy One. Now, I played the PS1 re-release Origins, which fixed a lot of problems one had originally, where it was turn-based. It'd be where you'd choose all your attacks and all your characters would go in order. So you didn't choose individually what your characters were doing. I don't think that happened until 4. There was no active time battle. And they fixed it so if you kill an enemy, your characters they used to miss, and now they don't do that. They just go to a different target if there's nothing to hit there anymore. So Origins did a lot. It did like a graphical update. It redid the music. It put a lot of quality of life changes in. So I would keep that in mind. If you're replaying these games at this point, you would probably be playing um, the remasters on Steam or something like that, or even like the GBA one. All right, so Final Fantasy One. I would put Final Fantasy One in B because it's just still a really solid game. Um, I don't want to say there's too much negative other than there's some objectives in it that aren't like super clear that these days you would just need to look up because who has time to just go around a map trying to figure out where to go next. So it can be a little confusing on what to do next, but otherwise it's pretty well balanced. At least the re-releases all are, and yeah, just a really solid game. Um, to this day. So let's see, where is 2? I should have put these in order before I started, but here we are. So Final Fantasy 2 is a little bit of a black sheep. It would probably be Final Fantasy 2. It would probably go between D and E. It's one I've never finished. I don't like the way you level up in that game. The difficulty spikes are all over the place. It's cool that there's more of a story than in one, but it's not. It doesn't make or break the game. Some cool music, of course. All of these have cool music, no matter where they go on the list. But you know, I can I can change this as we go if need be. But I'm going to put it in D for now. All right. So let's see what we got here. Actually, let's put an E. I I I I would skip this if you are looking to get into the series. All right. So 3. 3 is another interesting one because both 2 and 3 didn't come into the U.S. till much later. This 2 only came into the U.S. once the PS1 re-release came out, and same with 3. 3 actually came much even later than 2. It came out on a DS version, and 3's okay. 3 introduced the job system, which is gives you a lot of options. I mean, a lot of Final Fantasy has a lot of our games like Bravely Default. Pretty much still have the core of the job system in them, but the characters don't have much personality. They all start as like the same class, so it's not like our next game where you have like a dragoon or a white knight. There's some really good classes that kind of align with the characters. So yeah, I would put 3 in the D tier. Only thing I'll say about 3 is that its soundtrack is incredible. The version I originally played was the DS version, which was the first re-release, and I don't love the art style they've gone with. It's kind of that chibi Square Enix thing that like Bravely Default is still doing, and I really don't like how it looks. The original pixel art is still really good looking, like the NES, and the soundtrack, like I said, is actually top tier. So if anything, that what puts it above the E tier just because of the soundtrack. And if you're gonna play 1 through 6 these days, they just put the remasters on on Steam, and hopefully they come to Switch and consoles pretty soon. So there is 3. So next we got 4, and that was the first Super Nintendo Final Fantasy released in the U.S. It was Final Fantasy 2 to the Western world, but in Japanese order, it is number 4. So I would put same thing with 4. I think I played the 3DS remake of it first, and I kind of regret that because I do not like the way those games look. But it is a better game than 3 and 2. So with 4, like I said, I didn't play it in order. I feel like if I would have played it in order, 4 would have blew my mind back in the day. But I think I played 4 after I played 6, which is the US 3. It's really good. Like I said, strong characters, really good themes. Like the theme of love is still a really big Final Fantasy theme. You go to the moon, which is awesome. So there's some cool stuff happening in 4. Good character moments too. So I'm going to put that right there, right in C. That feels like a good place for 4. All right, so let's see. 5. So 5 is one I have never beaten. I've gotten pretty far, but I've never beaten it. And 5 takes the job system from 3 and kind of expands it into a much better system. I'm pretty sure 5 is the one where you can take abilities from other classes and kind of make hybrid classes. So 5 is really where the job system kind of took off, and it's kind of what like Bravely Default's bread and butter is. It all comes from this one. It's another one that didn't release in the US till the PS1 versions came out. 5. I would put 5 probably right along 4 for me personally. There are people that would rate it higher for sure, but it just never struck me in the same way. Like I said, I think I played 6 before I played 4 and 5, and that was I kind of went for the best of that Super Nintendo trilogy first, so that kind of really colored how I was looking at 4 and 5. So yeah, those are not bad games, and there are people that I know would put 4 and 5 somewhere along the upper tier here. So, all right, let's see. 3. Oh, 3. 6. All right. So here is Final Fantasy 6, which is technically Final Fantasy 3 in the US, but once 7 came out, they corrected all that. So 6 is great. 6 is one of the best Final Fantasies ever made. Super influential. Really started, it really led into what Final Fantasy would be, which would be a big cinematic, character driven, kind of epic. Um, so yeah, 6 has like the opera scene, which is really awesome. Some really good character moments with like Celis. Also, I love how 6 kind of fakes you out at the end, and there's like another game after, right when you think you're about to beat the game. Something crazy happens midway through. I won't spoil it, but it's very neat, and you don't see it that much today. And I love when games have like fake endings, and there's just more, like Symphony. Once I can think of it, like Symphony of the Night. More recently, Dragon Quest 11 has like 4 of them. And whether you liked it or not, Metal Gear Solid 5 has like a good fake credit sequence, and I think that's what Nier makes the whole Nier series really good. So, yeah, that stuff's really cool. But yeah, 6 fits right along like an amazing soundtrack, a lot of good characters. Yeah, and like I said, best way to play 1 through 6 is that those Steam re-releases. They did a pretty good job with those. All right, so moving on to 7. Okay, so this one is the one I'm gonna have to explain. Um, so 7, I played maybe like one of the last ones I played before I caught up, because I got into Final Fantasy right before 12 came out. So 10 was my first, and I played them in the order I could get them. They weren't, this was before digital purchases for this stuff was available, so I would just wait till my local game store um, would have these games for PS1, PS2, and they never had 7. So finally, they had 7 there, and I picked it up. But that was after I played like pretty much everything on this list. So it was like one of the last ones. And same thing with the way it ran with 6, is I had played 9 and 8 before 7, and one of those games is my favorite Final Fantasy. But so I'm gonna put 7 in C, just because it aged. It definitely aged. It didn't. I had been playing. I had played Final Fantasy X at that point, so like the graphics and the music and the expansiveness of it, it didn't hit me as hard as it would have in, like 97, when 3D games were just coming into their own. I'm sure I would have had my mind blown as well, but I'd already played 9, 8, 10. I was probably already playing 12 before I even got 7. No, for sure. Yeah. So, like open world games, and not that 7's necessarily an open world, but you know what I mean. Having a game that big wasn't as big a deal. And so I'll put 7 there. And just to make it worse, if Crisis Core was on this list, it would be above 7. And so would the remake. So there you go. Sorry, everyone. Hopefully you're still watching. All right, so moving on. Final Fantasy VIII, and I think like 2. Well, no, not like 2. This one is a divisive one. I feel like everyone knows 2's kind of, but 8's pretty divisive. Just because of its battle system, the junction system, where you kind of absorb like abilities from enemies or like magic, and then you put those magic towards stats like your strength or your HP, and it's a weird way of leveling up. And so either you really like that system, it's kind of for people that like want to mid max and grind, and like you can overpower your character really quickly, um, which is cool. Uh, so if you, and I honestly, I think it's one of the best soundtracks in the series, and it's like edgy as Squall could be. I do like the cast. I like the whole flying military school thing, very anime. So yeah, I really like 8 to this day. So I would put 8 right at a good B. That seems like a good place to be. And I didn't even talk about 2's battle system earlier. 2 it was kind of like that. It's kind of a better version of 2's. 2, the more you did something, the more it level up. So, like the more you attacked with your sword would level up. But you could break it. The more you got hit, your HP leveled up. So you could just tell your guys to hit each other and just kind of like overpower yourself early. But not in a fun way. You just kind of felt like you were cheating, and the rest of the game was kind of broken. All right, so we're on 2. Okay, Final Fantasy 9, which is, for the record, this is my favorite Final Fantasy. It wasn't my first, but it takes everything 1 through 6 did, and the strength of like 7 and 8 in the PS1. But at this point, they'd played, they'd been making PS1 games for a while, Square Enix. So I would say 9. 9 is definitely S tier for me. That is the cream of the crop right there. And it's not perfect. Loading times were a little iffy between battles, and I think that there might have been too many random battles in the dungeons, but you can really look past that. It's all the characters, the story is super charming. Like I said, the graphics are amazing. Actually, the best way to play is you can get it on Steam, and then you can download mods. I think it's called the Mogiri mod, and it took all the backgrounds and like AI upscaled them, and it looks like made it widescreen. It looks amazing. There are rumors that 9's going to get like a remaster or re-release. It already got like a re-release on PS4 and Steam and stuff, but like a remake, which would be crazy. I don't know if those are true or not, but I would be all for it. So yeah, 9 is right up there. All right. So Final Fantasy 10. So 10 was my first. So what got me into the series in the first place was actually Kingdom Hearts. Because in Jiminy's journal, you could look at the character like descriptions and bios, and all the Final Fantasies, it would list which Final Fantasy they were, and I was like, oh, these characters are from different games, okay. And finally, the one I picked up was 10 on PS2, and instantly it was kind of a game changer for me, because I had not played too many RPGs before that, and that really got me into more. I would probably say it got me out of just playing platformers and licensed games and things like that. So yeah, 10 is pretty important game for me. Oh, as much as I love 10, I would not put it in S tier just because um it has some like late game problems and difficulty spikes, and there are things that make it kind of hard to play the trials and stuff, but I would put it at probably A tier for me. I still think actually the visuals really hold up. All the music is like amazing. The voice acting is the one thing you kind of have to just deal with. It was really early in that game. It was like an early PS2 game, so only a few games have done voice acting, and fewer than that did it well. So 10 is pretty awkward. There's the laughing mean and everything, but I mean, not to say there isn't good voice acting. Like I think Auron and Lulu and stuff are really good. So yeah, 10's still great. Really cool battle system too. It kind of does that like timeline type thing. So it got away from the active time battle that like 4 through 9 all did. All right. So moving on. So 11 is probably the Final Fantasy I had the least experience in, just because it was an MMO that came out when I don't even think my house had internet. So I wouldn't put it on the like lower tiers just because I haven't played it, because 11 is a pretty important game for Square and for MMOs, just because it was the first online Final Fantasy, but it was also the first MMO that did crossplay between like consoles and PC. Not the first game, because I think Dreamcast definitely did some of that, but first MMO that did crossplay in that way. Later 360. It would probably be. It was a game before World of Warcraft, so it's a pre-WoW MMO, which should say a lot to you already. So it's a little hard to go back to, from what I understand. I've played a little, and yeah, it's pretty rough. But it is important to Square and MMOs, and what would later be, Final Fantasy 14. All right, so I'm gonna put 11. No, I'll put it in C. That seems like a decent place for it. All right, let's see. 11. So now we're moving on to 12. and 12 is an interesting one. It was by the director of Final Fantasy Tactics, headed up it, and as far as I know, he might have left before the game was finished, which kind of explains the kind of weird abrupt ending that doesn't wrap everything up they were building up to. So that was a weird ending, but Final Fantasy 12 is cool. It kind of started that whole like single player MMO type gameplay that like Xenoblade and things like that later ran with. Yeah, the visuals are amazing to this day. They really hold up. Like those remasters, look better than PS3 games. So yeah, Final Fantasy 12, really cool setting, different composer. So kind of gives it a different feel. I think the composer of Tactics and Vagrant Story and stuff did this. So I would put 12 probably in B for me, just because it was kind of a really cool, different game for someone who had never played like an MMO at that point. I thought it was really cool to be able to like program your allies, and yeah, 12 is a cool game. All right, so moving on to 13. Okay, 13. So 13, for context, came out like during the PS3 era, and that's when like the Japanese market were not ready for like HD gaming. A lot of them opted to just stay with the handhelds just because they just didn't know what to do. But when they did, they kind of really westernized the games instead of like making it their own. They really just tried to like ape what the West was doing, which, to be fair, the West was making much better, bigger games during this era. While while they were releasing things like White Knight Chronicles and just like really subpar JRPGs. Man, you were getting Fallout and Oblivion, and it makes sense why JRPGs fell out of favor around this era. And Square saw that, and they tried to do a different thing with 13. I don't know if it quite worked out. 13 visually, it looks really good, really incredible for the time, but you could tell it really suffered uh, their game design. I know 10's linear too. A lot of people say, "Well, you like 10, why don't you like 13?" And it's just like 10 at least still had villages, and 10 had a lot going on in it, and 13 really is just kind of a straight shot until you hit that open world, and even that open world is like there's not much to do. Um, Music again, awesome. So I would put 13 probably right around D for me personally. It was pretty disappointing at the time. It still is. I tried going back to 13 multiple times, and it's just not. I just have not been able to do it. So yeah, I would say, and as far as that whole trilogy we're just about to talk to, 13 through 13.3, I think that's the lowest point for Final Fantasy, just because they didn't know what to do with the series. They were still getting grips with the hardware, and this is the Japanese game market in general. I mean, with few exceptions, like this is when Demon Souls and Dark Souls were coming out, so like there was still really cool stuff coming out of Japan, but in like the JRPG market, it wasn't until like 2013 or 12. I think what was it? It was Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii, Last Story on the Wii, Ni no Kuni, and Fire Emblem Awakening and Persona 4 Golden all came out like within 6 months of each other, and those are like some of those are like all time greatest JRPGs, and they all released within 6 months, and so coming out, and that was right at the tail end of that generation. So coming into the PS4, they really started to nail down. Okay, we know the entire Japanese gaming market was really starting to get to grips with everything, and they just decided, we're just going to continue making our own games the way we did in the PS2 era. And now today, I mean, the Japanese games are again like the biggest games in the world. Resident Evil, Elden Ring, all that stuff. So yeah, it was just kind of a rough era for that, and Final Fantasy was right in the middle of that, not doing too hot. But let's just move on to 13.2, which is a better game than 13. Not the greatest game, but better. So I might put 13.2 just right above it. And yes, people seeing that 13.2 is as good as Final Fantasy 7, they might freak out about that. But you know what? That's okay. And actually, now looking at 13.2, I realized I skipped over 10.2. 10.2, oof. I would put 10.2 probably right at 13.2 level 2. 10.2 had a different director, totally different, like Final Fantasy X is a very melancholy game. And 10.2 has like a very different vibe going to it, but there's kind of like people just saying, "Oh, that's the pop game." They kind of like were disrespectful to what 10 was trying to do, but that's true in some sense. But in another, 10.2 actually has some really kind of uh dark moments. Like the first time you go back to Xanderkin and you see that they made it into like a tourist attraction, and if you played through 10, that area is kind of like a holy land in that game. Like it had like real significance. So there's some going through it and see it treating like a tourist center. It's kind of, it has those moments of like, oh wow, they're going for something here. I don't know if they stick the landing most of the time, but again, awesome music. It actually didn't use samples from the PS2 like sound library. It kind of used like real instruments and recordings, and yeah, that soundtrack is actually really good too. All right, so let's go back. So I did 13.2, and now here is Lightning Returns, and I have never been able to get anywhere in Lightning Returns because I cannot stand its tone and Lightning as a character and whatever they're trying to do. It's just nonsense. It makes zero sense. I've heard like the Punch Out gameplay is actually pretty cool, but the game itself just won't let me get to that point. It's just nonsense cutscenes, and I can't. Yeah, I've tried. Trust me, I tried. I downloaded it on the backwards compatibility for Xbox because it like increased it to like 4K and 60 frames, and even with that, I was just like, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. So I'm gonna put Lightning Returns right below E, and that was kind of where the trilogy 13 leads off for me. So yeah, just not the greatest time for Final Fantasy. All right. So next, 14. 14's a weird one because it started out so poorly. 14, if they didn't remake, if Yoshi P didn't come in and they didn't reboot 14, this would be like an E tier game. This would be, I mean, at least these are functional games. It might be below E tier. It was that bad, that dire, which is probably why they did what they did, which is bring Yoshi P in and pretty much build a new Final Fantasy 14 and release alongside it. So that new Final Fantasy 14 is awesome. One of my becoming one of my favorite games ever. And it's like I said, it's not perfect either. Like they had to the first part of A Realm Reborn, the when they rebooted it, they had to do it so fast that if you replay it these days, it's just not to the quality the expansions would get to as far as like story and variety and things like that. But it's just such a solid, fun game. The community is awesome. It's really blown up in the last few years, but every expansion, even though I thought Shadowbringers was a fair bit better than Endwalker, it still didn't disappoint. And it's just like a really good. It's just they balance like fan service and their own story. The soundtrack is amazing. Uh, the fact that the 14 team is ahead of 16, is heading up 16, gives me just the utmost confidence that that game is going to be just a killer game. So yeah, I would put 14 probably in S tier. Just for the expansions alone, like just for like Shadowbringers and Heaven's Word, and Endwalker's great too, and Shadowbringers all right, but whatever. I mean, it's just been 10 years of awesome content and really good community feedback, and Yoshi P and team they deserve that S tier spot. They put so much work into this game. So yeah, and that moves us on to 15. 15 is disappointing because the original trailers looked really awesome. Like the way Noctis would like throw a sword around and warp to it, like it made your mind Wander and be like, wow, there'd be really cool like gameplay. It almost looked like an Uncharted version of Final Fantasy when they first showed it. And when it came out, I mean, this was a troubled game. It was like 10 years in development. It switched directors from Nomura to I forget what his name is, but he directed Crisis Core. So and it just had a really troubled long development, and it kind of shows. They made this open world, and there's not all that much to do in it. And then halfway through the game, it stops becoming an open world and becomes more like Final Fantasy 13 and time jumps. And yeah, it's just kind of a mess near the end. Um, so 15 had a lot of potential, but a lot of wasted potential, in my opinion. So I'm going to put that right along 13. And to be fair, I've not played 15 since it launched, so I know a lot of DLC maybe, but everything I've seen has not been enough for me to go back. It was just disappointing. Okay, and last I have 12 Revenant Wings, which is it's it's almost not shouldn't be on this list. It's really not a main tier game, but it was just a DS tower defense game that had Final Fantasy 12 characters in it, and technically it was a direct sequel, but it barely had anything going on. Like I said, it was just a tower defense game, so it's fine for what it is, but I'm just gonna put it right. I just put it in E. It's not great. It's just kind of there. All right, and then for the after years, this was a WiiWare title. And it was a sequel to 4. I forget what the timeline is. I think it takes place like 5 years after. And that's not it's from what I've heard and what I played, it's not great. I don't know what went wrong in development. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's not great, but it just isn't. So, you can just play 4 proper and you'd probably be good. But yeah, that's kind of where the Final Fantasy series sits in my head. There's not, I think the most controversial thing on this list is probably 7's placement alongside 13.2 and 10.2 and 4. I could see that. I know not every list you're gonna always disagree, but yeah, that kind of lays it out. So yeah, like I said, that 9 remake, I hope it happens because that game deserves it. It's kind of people came off of 7 and 8, and that's what Final Fantasy was. Like a lot of people jumped in at 7, so they thought it was kind of like a futuristic kind of steampunky thing. And then when 9 came out and was harkening back to like 1 through 6 with kind of its medieval cartoony characters, I think a lot of people wrote it off. And Final Fantasy 10 was really so close. After 9, a lot of people just waited and played 10, and that's a shame because 9 is amazing. And over time, I feel like 9's kind of gotten its due online. A lot of people that played 9, it is their favorite Final Fantasy. It's pretty incredible. So yeah, and 14 with Final Fantasy 16 coming up, that'll be next year. I just have a lot of confidence in it. It's by the FF14 team. Yoshi P is a producer, but the director, the composer, like all of them are just like leads in FF14, and they've been making like amazing expansions for almost a decade now for 14. So at least character wise, and I mean the combat looks awesome. They got a DMC5 guy in there, and that's cool. So yeah, nothing I've seen of 16 is making me worry, and knowing 14 teams pedigree, I think that game's going to be really special. So we'll see where that lands. Hopefully in S tier. That'd be awesome. It looks like there hasn't been an S. Well, I guess 14 for me is the most recent one and deserves. But I would love for Final Fantasy to come back into relevancy after the 13 trilogy falling on its face so hard, and deservedly. I don't know what they were thinking. But yeah, that is my Final Fantasy tier list. Thanks for sticking with me, and this is just a bonus episode, so I'll probably release this in between one of our main ones. We'll see. But yeah, thanks for listening in if you're listening to the podcast, or if you're on YouTube and seeing me endlessly scroll my page up and down my mouse, which is probably annoying, I just realized. And thanks for showing up. All right. See you guys soon. Bye.